First of all, I want to thank everybody for trying to stay awake at the end of a very long day. I very much appreciate your efforts. And I also want to thank, again, especially Boaz and Miriam for putting together this wonderful conference. And it's been a tremendous experience so far. And that everybody has just been, I found it a really enriching and rewarding experience. And I look forward to having one more day. My dissertation looks at the family life of post-war Holocaust survivors, and what I found is that I'm very dependent on oral testimony, both that which I have found and that which I've done myself. And that had me thinking about a lot of the questions that arise when we use these audiovisual documents. And I do think of them as documents. And so what I'm going to present today is some thoughts about how we can, as historians, and I do I am a historian, how we can best use these documents in fairness to both the subject and to the rigors of scholarly discipline. So Holocaust survivor video testimonies are exceptionally complex historical documents that pose numerous challenges for historians. Due to the traumatic nature of Holocaust experiences, the reliability of survivors' memories is especially difficult to determine, and the interview format and audiovisual elements add multiple layers of meaning. Interwoven among these problems of historical interpretation are complicated ethical issues arising from the reverence in which Holocaust and its survivors are held. However, when our respect and empathy for survivors inadvertently leads to unquestioning belief in the historical accuracy of their testimony, errors can occur. In this paper, what I'm doing is trying to evaluate the reliability of survivor oral testimony and examine some of the ways in which it can be utilized. Such uses, I believe, should demonstrate respect for both survivors and for the historical value of their testimony, but scholars cannot afford to sacrifice our intellectual integrity. We therefore need to ask critical questions about the reliability of survivors' memories, despite general pressure for critical acceptance of the validity of survivor testimony. The very term Holocaust survivors denotes a category of people who have survived encounters with profound evil and are therefore burdened with stories that no one else can tell. I would argue that, as a result of this conceptualization of survivors, an unspoken compact has been formed between survivors and non-survivors. Survivors are morally obligated to be truthful about the atrocities they have witnessed, and in return, those of us who are not survivors, and can therefore never understand what survivors have endured, unconditionally believe them. This suspension of disbelief is encouraged by our empathy with survivors. Through our empathy, we demonstrate our belief in the veracity of their stories, thus fulfilling our side of the compact. An important factor in establishing the reliability of survivor memory is determining whether traumatic events are remembered accurately. Some scientific evidence suggests that traumatic memory may be more accurate than other types of memories. According to psychoanalytic theory, memory becomes traumatic when it does not fit into the normal constraints of reality. The memory of the trauma thus becomes an ongoing event within the victim's psyche, existing alongside the present. Furthermore, according to psychologist Daniel Schachter, psychological studies have shown that people remember events more clearly when they are emotionally charged, and traumatic incidents are inherently laden with emotion. Schachter terms this ability to forget persistence, which in turn causes detailed memories of trauma to become intrusive, often through vivid perceptual image. However, there is an opposing psychoanalytic theory which maintains that trauma victims are so shocked by their experiences that they fail to comprehend and thus remember what actually happened. So as a result, their memories are suppressed and become skewed, making it less likely that traumatic memories are accurate. Following the first theory of traumatic memory, which argues that traumatic memory is more reliable, that suggests that survivors have the ability, and I do use that word very advisedly, to relive experiences, and which suggests that traumatic memories may be more reliable than other forms. In his book, Testimony, Crises of Witnessing in Literature, Psychoanalysts, and History, psychoanalyst and survivor Dory Laub writes that he believes his own vivid memories of the Holocaust are exact memories of his childhood experiences, including his thoughts and emotions from the time. However, he notes, seemingly without awareness of the possible contradiction, that his memories appear to possess more maturity than normal childhood memories. This assertion is further complicated by the fact that Laub is speaking as much about the accuracy of survivors' recollections of their emotions as about the factual accuracy of their memories of the traumatic event itself. However, despite these issues, I do believe that Holocaust survivor testimony remains a valuable source that can be utilized in a great many ways. One use for survivor testimony, as we've discussed at length in various sessions at this conference, is as a resource for uncovering new topics of research. For example, one of the most prominent examples is Jan Gross's book Neighbors, which originated from his discovery of the testimony of Shmuel Wasserstein, testimony which, it should be noted, was given in 1945 and therefore avoids some of these post-war memory problems that we've discussed. Wasserstein was only one of 7 Jews to survive the massacre that occurred in the town of Yebabne during the Holocaust, and as such, his testimony was both extremely valuable and extremely difficult to corroborate. Gross was eventually able to uncover records from post-war perpetrator trials which confirmed Wasserstein's testimony, and these two complementary sources became the basis for Neighbors. As a result of this process of research that Gross went through, he has a quite lengthy plea in Neighbors for historians to accept survivors' testimonies as true, unless presented with a reason to do otherwise. And I'm going to here quote Gross's exact words. When considering survivors' testimonies, we would be well advised to change the starting premise in appraisal of their evidentiary contribution from an a priori critical to in principle affirmative. By accepting what we read in a particular account as fact until we find persuasive arguments to the contrary, we would avoid more mistakes than we are likely to commit by adopting the opposite approach, which calls for cautious skepticism towards any testimony until an independent confirmation of its content has been found. The greater the catastrophe, the fewer the survivors. We must be capable of listening to lonely voices reaching us from the abyss. With this plea, Gross is arguing that historians are morally obligated to adhere to the unspoken compact of belief between survivors and non-survivors. If we express any skepticism with regards to survivors' testimonies, then we risk becoming incapable of listening to the lonely voices reaching us from the abyss. In other words, of ignoring or even doubting the horrors that the victims of the Nazis endured. It cannot be denied that there is a compelling sense of moral imperative in Gross's impassioned plea. However, I do not believe that Gross fully considered the implications of his arguments. Gross was, in a sense, lucky. Wasserstein's testimony was proven to be more or less accurate. As we have seen, Memory, even traumatic memory, is slippery. If Wasserstein's testimony had been found to be incorrect with regards to anything major, the ensuing controversy could have undermined the fundamental truths about the Yavne massacre. One need only to look at the story of so-called Holocaust survivor Benjamin Wilkomirski, a man whose widely acclaimed memoir of surviving the Holocaust was proved to be utterly fake, to see a further problem. The easy acceptance of Wilkomirski's tale effectively illustrates the dangers inherent within the compact of belief. By uncritically believing survivors' stories, we lose our ability to distinguish between real and false survivors. We must also be aware of the benefits that a certain degree of intellectual distance from the emotions of listening to survivor testimony provides us. Part of the compact of belief is empathy on the part of the listener. While I would never suggest that Holocaust testimony should be viewed without empathy, listening to survivor testimony is an intense emotional experience, and it's easy to react strongly to survivors' emotions, even to conflate their emotions with our own, a step which would destroy any possibility of critical analysis. When approached with appropriate caution, however, the emotion displayed in Holocaust testimony becomes one of its most useful attributes as a historical source. I believe that the large body of survivor testimony is a significant resource for analyzing the emotions of victims during the Holocaust. Relatively few contemporary sources survived the Holocaust, and most of these were written while their authors were in hiding or in ghettos, as opposed to concentration camps. Primary sources that were created after the Holocaust are, of course, written memoirs or audiovisual testimony. While these different formats yield different important insights into the emotions that victims felt during the Holocaust, the pronounced differences between the mediums allow them to complement each other. In a written memoir, writers carefully choose their words to best construct the desired effect. Oral testimony, in contrast, allows the speaker only a few moments to search for a word. Both approaches have advantages and disadvantages, and I would not argue that either is necessarily more accurate than the other. The audiovisual elements of oral testimonies, however, may convey more meaning than either speech or text alone, because it allows the speaker to, consciously or unconsciously, produce more layers of expression. The viewer can observe what causes the survivor to laugh or to cry. The viewer can also interpret a survivor's silences, as well as their words and tone. Indeed, I would argue that the ability to listen to silence is an integral part of being able to fully hear survivor oral testimony. In considering survivor testimony, historians need to evaluate how a survivor's post-war experiences may bias his memories. According to Schechter, when we remember past events in our lives, we can, and I quote, add feelings, beliefs, or even knowledge we obtained after the experience. Therefore, we bias our memories by attributing to them emotions or knowledge we acquired after the event. As with factual memories, this potential for unconsciously biasing memories of emotion means that historians should not necessarily accept survivor statements about their past emotional states as completely accurate. For example, survivors' memories of how they felt at the moment of liberation may have been later tainted by learning how few of their loved ones survived. Schechter terms this taint a hindsight bias, which occurs when recollections of past events are filtered by current knowledge. Survivors may also be prone to projecting current stereotypical behaviors of right and wrong onto their memories of the past because their Holocaust experiences were so radically different from their post-war lives. Lawrence Langer's concept of the doubling of the self, which he borrows heavily from Charlotte Delbo, may also be applicable here. For Langer, Holocaust survivors frequently have two selves, the self that endured the Holocaust and the self able to function within normal, daily, i.e. post-Holocaust life. Although not all survivors, according to Langer, are cognizant of these dual aspects of their identities. These dual identities form because survivors' experiences within each world were so radically different that they are unable to fully comprehend how the same person was able to function in both. This leads to their feeling as though a stranger lived through the Holocaust. These two identities may seem entirely separate to survivors, even though they understand that both sets of experiences belong to them. If this doubling keeps the past separate from the present, as Langer argues, then this would provide Holocaust memories with further insulation from memory bias. However, Langer also argues that the part of the survivor that exists in normal life is capable of reflecting on what their other self must have felt like then. Historians must carefully analyze testimony in order to decide which self is speaking, to use Langer's terminology, or to determine whether a memory has been altered by bias, to use Schachter's framework. Oral testimony may also provide valuable insight into the post-Holocaust lives of survivors. Although survivors do not always speak at length about their post-war lives, references are often found throughout their interview. When one survivor admits to constantly thinking about starvation, or when another discusses how, quote, life was one big hell after the war, they are referring to the way that the Holocaust has affected their lives. They are also alluding to how being a Holocaust survivor makes reintegrating into normal society a recurrent challenge. Discussing post-war experiences during an interview about their wartime experiences, however, increases the likelihood that survivors will remember their post-war experiences as negative. According to Schachter, the way that we remember past pain is strongly affected by how we feel at the moment, and it is to be only expected that remembering the Holocaust is extremely painful for survivors. Because of this phenomenon, memoirs may provide a more accurate portrayal of post-war life than Holocaust testimonies. The process of writing a memoir affords the survivors a degree of separation between the traumatic events of the Holocaust and the events that happened afterwards, and may, and I do stress the may, color these events to a smaller degree. Another less typical historiographical approach to survivor testimony that could be used is to apply Jan Assmann's concept of cultural memory to the study of Holocaust oral testimony. According to Assmann, modern cultural memories are based in textual archives and are formed when cultures select texts about important topics that need to be remembered in the future. The establishment of survivor testimony archives are examples of the formation of archives of cultural memory about the Holocaust, but there's one significant difference between the archives of survivor testimony and the examples Assmann uses. Assmann's examples are drawn from collections which were anthologized and published. Most oral testimony collections have not been edited or disseminated in this way. The oral testimony archive, or archives, are therefore more accurately described as an archive of potential cultural memory that has not fully permeated into the public consciousness. To use Assmann's terms, it is memory that has been stored but has not become a bonding force within a culture. Once collections of oral testimonies have been anthologized and published, however, Assmann's theory of cultural memory can be productively applied. Most institutions with survivor testimony have produced and disseminated educational materials utilizing this testimony. Since an examination of these collections addresses how testimony has been used, and not the testimony itself, this approach has the additional advantage of bypassing many of the issues surrounding survivor memory. In conclusion, given the problematic nature of traumatic memories, historians cannot assume Holocaust survivor oral testimony is accurate without corroboration. Despite this, uncorroborated testimonies can still be useful, although they must be used with extreme caution. Survivor oral testimonies are extremely valuable in particular areas of historical endeavor, especially in emotional and cultural history. They are also useful as a resource for uncovering events that still need to be researched. Additionally, the audio and visual dimensions of video testimonies allow historians to access valuable layers of interpretation not available in other formats. Historians must remain wary of the traps involved in the compact of belief. One of the major obstacles to the use of survivor testimony is the frequent perception of Holocaust survivors as possessing an almost sacred status. But if historians accept the quasi-sanctification of survivors, we ultimately have no choice but to uphold the compact of belief. However, this cannot be done without abdicating our responsibility to historical truth. Holocaust survivors undoubtedly do their best to be truthful and accurate while giving their testimony. Most survivors have no reason to lie, and they have every moral incentive to tell the truth. However, they are human, and the years since their traumatic experiences have exacted a toll upon their memory. It is the responsibility of historians, not survivors, to evaluate the extent to which survivors accurately recall their experiences. Historians cannot allow their respect or empathy for survivors to interfere with the critical analysis of survivor testimony. Indeed, without critical analysis, survivor testimony would be held to a lower standard of proof than other sources, and our understanding of the Holocaust would be distorted, thus dishonoring both survivors and victims. Thank you.